Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Africa and India. There's a new partnership forming on the global stage, and it might just be a real challenge to China's dominance. We'll tell you about some of the successes and challenges ahead for Africa and its partners. Also this week, more on Volkswagen, its first loss in 15 years as it reels from the emissions cheating scandal. But how much will it really end up paying in fines and recall costs? And will these workers manage to keep their jobs in the process? And a demographic time bomb which has been holding back growth. China ends its 1970s one-child policy as part of a new economic plan. You know, if the continent of Africa were to have a best friend, we'd probably say it was China. It's invested billions there, building infrastructure and doing business well before other countries tried to get in. But now another country with more than a passing acquaintance with Africa wants to cement its future there, and that is India. Case in point, New Delhi has just hosted an India-Africa summit this past week, and leaders and business players from every African country came along. India's big push was that it wanted to promote a relationship between continent and subcontinent, but one that was particularly beneficial to Africa. Many saw that as a dig at China, which is often seen as just coming into Africa and making lots of money for itself. India is also looking for political influence, seeking support from the 54 African nations to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Why the big love-in over Africa now? Well, it's the second largest and second most populous continent on Earth. Well over 1 billion people are living there in 2015. And that translates into economic growth. The total GDP of the African continent is now over $2.8 trillion and has been growing at over 5% every year. Now, yes, China is a big factor. Have a look at this. Chinese trade with Africa, $160 billion a year. For the record, the European Union remains the biggest trading partner. And at this stage, India is less than half of that. Trade is only $71 billion a year. It is targeting $90 billion, though, by the end of this year. But unlike China, which tends to invest in huge infrastructure and vanity projects, India is relying on its corporations and large diaspora to win over hearts and minds. And you know, there are successes. In a moment, Harun Tata will take a look at how Zimbabwe is looking to India to help revive its industry. But first, India's largest automobile maker, Tata, is in Senegal, where it's replacing polluting French-made vans with Indian-made buses. Nicholas Huck starts us off.
Every morning, no matter how hard she tries, Abijata is always running late for work. She works in town but lives in the suburbs. Finding reliable transportation isn't easy. This is the best option. They're called car rapide, but they're anything but fast. Frequent stops, breakdowns, and traffic congestion makes this the most unpleasant part of Abby's day.
I dread this moment, where I have to sit in here for hours endlessly. The buses always smell of gasoline. It's such an unpleasant start to the day.
Imported from France, these old Renaults have been around since the 1970s. Senegalese drivers have added colorful touches to the exteriors, but on the inside, the basic mechanics haven't changed in more than 40 years. The state wants to get rid of them in a bid to reduce pollution and the volume of traffic.
These vans are dangerous and not adapted for a modern city. Our goal is to replace them with vehicles that will offer more comfort and a better service for people working in town.
Bus drivers had their say on which manufacturer would replace the car rapide. Much to everyone's surprise, they chose the Indian car maker Tata to revamp the entire transport system, outbidding Chinese and European car makers, including Renault, who offered better quality buses that pollute a lot less than Tata. But the Indian car maker was cheaper and willing to modify its vehicles to adapt to Senegalese driving.
The traffic in India is very similar to the traffic that you find here in Dakar. And so the Indian manufacturer believes that it has the know-how and the fleet of vehicles adapted for this environment to get people from the suburbs into the city and decongest this growing metropolis.
We understand the kind of vehicles that are required here. We ourselves are a developing country. We do understand the kind of technology which is required.
And so Tata is betting on this, the magic ace. With 1 million sold in India, it's a no-frills van. There are no windows in the back or electronics, just a strong engine. But it still needs to convince African consumers. Tata is testing the magic in Senegal and had to already make changes, more headroom and better suspensions, making Abby's commute home a little less bumpy, a little more comfortable, but still a long journey home.
Zimbabwe's manufacturing sector used to employ more than 200,000 people. Now it's fewer than half that figure. So government officials are looking to India for help in reviving struggling companies, like the Zimbabwe Iron and Steel Company, now called New Zim Steel. India, an emerging market, stands to benefit from Zimbabwe's iron ore exports. Zimbabwe has been trading with India for decades, but there have been problems.
It's a long-standing relationship, but given the fact that I would say the economy of Zimbabwe has been going through some difficult times, and that has obviously has had an impact between the trade and the economic ties between the two countries. And so currently I would say that things are somewhat dormant.
Over the years, thousands of people have lost their jobs because of widespread electricity shortages, falling manufacturing output, and businesses downsizing or closing.
I was born in 1954. As from 1954, I think my parents were working in this company. Even then, I also worked in this company, and I've raised my children from this company, but the way it is happening now is something which is very disgraceful.
Laid-off workers have been told by the government a new investor is coming and New Zim Steel will resume operations soon. This used to be Africa's largest steel manufacturer before it collapsed in 2008. More than 5,000 people used to work here. The place was busy. The steel was sold all over the world. Now it's barely functioning. But some fear of investing in Zimbabwe because of political instability, allegations of corruption and indigenization, a policy that favors black Zimbabweans.
The motivation behind indigenization is to scale up the involvement of locals in the economy. And it is a good policy because it provides for political stability. If we can have a situation where we have a strong black middle class.
Zimbabwe's biggest export to India is cotton. Officials say the country has potential to export more precious minerals like diamonds and raw materials like iron ore. Zimbabwe imports medical drugs from India and electrical appliances. So far, the trade balance favors India, something Zimbabwean officials hope to change.
So Africa and India, we've got one of our Counting the Cost regulars to join us this week to talk us through that. It's Razia Khan in London, who's an economist and head of Africa research at Standard Chartered Bank. Razia, nice to see you again. What can India do differently in Africa to what China's done? You know, we all know China is the big influence. From what you can see, has India got a different approach?
Well, there's been a lot of focus, of course, on these rising trade corridors. And whilst Africa-China has been seen to be really exceptional, we've seen an increase in the amount of Africa-China trade from barely $4 billion in the mid-1990s, closer to $224 billion more recently. When one looks at the India-Africa trade numbers, the numbers look less impressive, but the growth rates are still very significant. Very crucially, there's been a big difference in the nature of involvement. We've seen a lot of state-to-state engagement in the case of China, and of course, when it comes to a lot of the India-Africa engagement, a lot more of it is driven by the private sector, by private sector Indian corporate entities investing more in Africa.
And so do you believe then, Razia, that that is a better approach, that going through the private sector and making things happen that way is more effective, if I use that phrase, than a state-led approach? You know, the handouts and the infrastructures, even the sort of vanity projects, which we have to admit do become a feature of this sort of thing.
Well, as is always the case, there are probably two ways of looking at this. One is, why have we seen this huge increase in the amount of China-Africa engagement? It followed on very specifically from the kind of policy that China had adopted as regarded Africa, and also a lot of the Chinese policy banks making available to Chinese entities cheaper financing for their export activities into Africa. So even though we've seen rising trade shares between Africa and just about every other region in the world, it pales in comparison with respect to China. Now, of course, we've been aware of the other side of that as well, the criticism that there hasn't been as much engagement with Africa's private sector, that the benefits have been fairly limited, the infrastructure is good, but what does it really do to build capacity in Africa itself? And this is perhaps an area where India will hope that it can differentiate itself somewhat. The very fact that it is more private sector to private sector should have implications for non-government job creation that should be better able to weather the economic cycles that are caused by fluctuations in the amount of resources that governments have to spend. That, of course, is about to be put to a key test because of perceptions of the China slowdown, because of the volatility that we've seen in commodity prices. We are expecting that there may well be a slowdown in the amount of government-driven activity in Africa, simply as different governments feel the need to put in place more of a fiscal consolidation. In this respect, is the rising level of private sector FDI, including the FDI from India, going to be enough?
Well, you talk about the perception of a slowdown in China. I would argue that it very much is a slowdown and that India has got its timing perfectly here. I mean, it's probably no coincidence, really, but this is a great opportunity timing-wise for India, isn't it?
Well, in that sense, yes, in terms of seeing much more of an outward focus, which we haven't necessarily seen from India all the way through its economic history. One of the other factors that distinguishes China from India is, of course, China is a much more open economy. A lot more of what happens with its economy has been driven by trade. That may change somewhat as the authorities attempt more of a rebalancing between consumption and investment in China, but it does create opportunities for India, for Indian entities, to be that much more externally focused.
Okay, just flip the story around for me for a moment, Razia, and tell me what Africa has got to offer India. Oil is the obvious thing which we think of, but what else is out there which India could capitalize from in this relationship?
If we look at the actual nature of India-Africa trade and what has driven those increased volumes that we've seen in recent years, India's exports to Africa are relatively diversified. So India does sell a range of different consumer goods to Africa. It has focused very heavily on telecoms equipment, on pharmaceuticals, and it is seen to have something of an edge in this respect. The real challenge actually comes from the African side. We know that African countries have been locked into the situation of largely being commodity dependent economies. How can they see more beneficiation? How can they see more value added? And as they seek out equally rapidly growing economies, trading partners in the rest of the world, such as India, how is it that Africa is able to add more value to its exports? So yes, India does buy oil from Africa. It exports a great deal to Africa, ranging from pharmaceuticals to a wide range of consumer goods. But as Africa is increasingly focused on what it is gaining from these trade relationships, there is going to be this need to see higher beneficiation, to see higher value added taking place in Africa itself. What does Africa, what do sub-Saharan African economies ultimately offer to India? Well, it's still a region, part of the global economy that is expected to be growing reasonably rapidly for some time. And so in terms of growth, in terms of the opportunity, it's not just Indian entities, but quite a lot of different foreign entities that will still be looking very closely at sub-Saharan Africa.
Razia Khan from Standard Chartered Bank with us this week talking India-Africa. Razia, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, the defusing of a demographic time bomb. China ends its one-child policy, but we'll tell you why some couples actually may not want another child. Right now, though, more on Volkswagen. Last week, we looked at the legal implications of the emissions cheating scandal. This week, more on the company itself. A $3.8 billion loss for the third quarter was a massive failure for VW, and it raises questions about whether there's more bad news to come, whether the brand can recover, and if workers' jobs are on the line too. Emma Hayward has this report from Berlin.
It has dominated the Wolfsburg skyline for decades, and while steam still pours from the headquarters of Europe's biggest car maker, inside, anxious times at VW, embroiled in scandal, as it endures its first quarterly loss for at least 15 years.
The first and most important priority is helping our customers as quickly as possible and as comprehensively as necessary.
Volkswagen is having to recall millions of cars around the world after it admitted it had cheated on some emissions tests. For some of the 60,000 workers in Wolfsburg, it's business as usual, but there are worries.
It's a depressing atmosphere. We talk about it all the time.
The atmosphere is down. A lot of people are quite cautious because they don't know how it is going to continue. The next year is going to be tough for VW. But surely VW will bounce back in the end.
That's what many in this town are hoping for. VW has warned its profits for the whole year will be down. This quarterly loss is largely down to the huge amounts of money the company has put aside to pay for costs incurred in the scandal. Its repair bill will run into billions of dollars, while the price of restoring consumer confidence is hard to quantify. The future of many of these workers now depends on how well VW can recover trust in its brand, a brand which had been built on reliability and trust. VW says an independent investigation will take place to try to understand what happened. The company, one of Germany's biggest and one of the world's leading car makers, could face criminal charges.
Well, earlier in the week, I spoke to Arndt Ellinghorst, who heads up global automotive research at the advisory firm Evercore, for his take on the VW situation. We started by talking about those quarterly figures.
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty much bang in line with our expectations. The company has indicated before that they put aside 6.5 billion euros for the diesel recall. If you take that out, they reported more than 3 billion in clean operating income, a very strong cash flow, and a net liquidity of 28 billion, which is obviously very essential given the challenges that they're now facing.
Well, they're quite possibly going to need that, aren't they? Because the estimations, I think, well, the difference between Volkswagen's estimations for what's going to be needed to sort this out and a lot of analysts' ones is a huge difference.
Well, you know, that happens when you sit in front of a spreadsheet and you plug in big numbers, right? I mean, I think it's going to cost them probably all in around 28 billion euros before tax. But to be fair, it's very hard to estimate, especially the costs from potential volume losses, net pricing, or litigation issues, especially in the US. But, you know, everyone's trying to make a guess. That's my number. The company can survive that. I don't believe they need fresh equity, but it's very painful, of course.
Okay, yeah, so they can survive the financial hit there, but the hit to the brand reputation, I mean, this is a company where you associated reliability and trust with Volkswagen, and I think now, quite simply, you don't. That type of damage could be huge.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, currently, you know, everything's at question at Volkswagen. They suffer massively with customers. But if you look back what happened to Toyota with their devastating recalls, or even GM in the US, companies get through this. And I think brand equity is very often underestimated by the market, and also the loyalty of customers at the end of the day.
Should Volkswagen be looking elsewhere with its, I'm talking about its actual technology here? They've had a very strong focus on diesel, obviously. Now that is somewhat tainted. What about electrics and the like? Have they invested enough in that to diversify and to keep the brand going in a positive direction?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Kamal. Volkswagen is the biggest spender globally of any company in any sector when it comes to research and development. And when you look at the innovation that's coming out of Volkswagen, it's not really great. And you're going to ask yourself, where's VW when it comes to electric vehicles, to hybrid vehicles? Why is Toyota, even though they're spending 40% less, so much more advanced? I think VW really has to consider where they're spending the money and which technologies really are the future, which diesel just really isn't.
No, exactly. So is this from what, I mean, I know they've only had new leadership in for a short time, but do you think they're making the right noises about that sort of thing? Or at the moment, is it just the damage control and sorting out the problem with the emissions scandal?
Yeah, look, I'm just off the Q3 conference call with the new CEO, with the new CFO and their head of sales. At the moment, it really seems that it's about dealing with the crisis situation, putting the right measures and pillars in place to change the culture within Volkswagen. But it's still, a bit too early talking about the next step in innovation. They just lost a couple of people, leading people in research and development. I think it's a little bit early to answer that question for them, to be honest.
Fair enough. So your view is that Volkswagen, the brand won't be as damaged as perhaps people think, and that, I mean, I don't want to say this will all just blow over, but that in the end, people's habits will come back. If they've driven Volkswagens for a long time, they'll probably stay with them, that sort of thing?
Well, the company says that their current order intake isn't really impacted materially. Even the mix between diesel and gasoline engine isn't materially impacted. I mean, it shows you that the substance of the VW brand, especially in their Western European markets, is pretty strong. China is probably totally unaffected by all of this. The biggest issue really is the US, but they've never really been very big with the VW brand. So I do think, yes, they can come through this. They will come through this. And VW is not just the VW brand. It's Porsche, Audi, Scania trucks, and so forth. It's a big organization.
We're going to look at China now, and I think it goes without saying that you don't get the kind of growth China's had without some sort of plan. This week there was a major change to that plan. China finally announced the end of its one-child policy that was introduced in the 1970s. Because something that was supposed to make sure China's population wasn't outstripping its resources has actually been holding back its growth. Rob McBride has more.
The announcement came at the end of the Communist Party's four-day gathering of its leadership, mapping out the next five-year plan. The strategy sets broad economic goals for China's development, but it's the change in the country's one-child policy that has been the most eagerly anticipated by many families here. It had already been partially relaxed, allowing families where at least one parent is from a one-child family themselves to have two children. Now that is being extended to all couples.
The importance of this measure is not so much demographic in terms of encouraging vast new numbers of children to be born, but it is the lifting of a highly restrictive and at times extremely coercive policy, as we have heard.
The one-child policy was brought in to control China's burgeoning population. Its cancellation will be popular, but a number of couples like Sam Chow and Zhu Rong haven't decided to have another child. For them, careers and living costs in Beijing are the priority.
My wife and I don't have any specific plan for the second child.
Their 7-year-old son, Henry, though, is in no doubt. He wants a sibling.
I want a sister.
As well as the social and relationship problems associated with a generation of one-child families is the longer-term demographic imbalance. There's a growing number of elderly people who need to be supported by an ever-shrinking working population. A one-child policy put in place more than 30 years ago to avoid one population crisis has to be abandoned to avoid another in the future. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
And that's almost it for this week, but as ever, there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or just drop us an email. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. One final thing to mention this week, it is the last edition of Counting the Cost for our business editor, Abid Ali, who's leaving Al Jazeera. Now, he didn't want me to even mention this, but I couldn't not acknowledge everything he's done in the past 7 years for me and this program. Through the global economic crisis, in this studio, out on the road from Dubai to Davos to the Philippines, we've worked together to bring you this show each week, and it's thanks to Abid's vision that we've taken business and economics news to a different place, away from stocks and markets, and into the stories of real people and places you don't always hear about. So, Abid, thank you for everything, and good luck with your next venture. That is it for this week's Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.